The night was so dark you could not see your own hands. The only sound above the eastern front was wind. Then came something else, a faint rustle, like fabric tearing slowly through cold air. German soldiers on the ground had heard it before. They reached for their rifles. They aimed at nothing. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then the bombs fell. By the time the flares went up, the plane was already gone, swallowed again by the black sky. The soldiers had no radar to track it, no radio signal to intercept, only the distant hum of a disappearing engine and the fires spreading below them. They had a name for whatever came out of that darkness. They called it Die Nachthexen, the night witches. What terrified them most was not the explosions. It was knowing that when dawn came, those pilots would sleep. And then, when night fell again, they would come back. Every single night, without fail, for 3 years. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to 1941. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd of that year. Within weeks, the Soviet Union was in a state of collapse. Entire army groups were encircled and destroyed. Cities fell within days. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the opening months. Stalin's military leadership was struggling to respond. The Red Army needed every available resource, every vehicle, every bullet, every person willing to fight. Marina Raskova understood that better than almost anyone. She was already famous in the Soviet Union before the war began. In 1938, she had set a world long-distance flight record for women, flying over 6,000 kilometers with her crew. Stalin personally greeted her when she landed. When the war started, women across the Soviet Union began writing to her. Hundreds of letters from young women who wanted to fight. Raskova took those letters to Stalin himself. She asked for permission to form all-female aviation regiments. Stalin agreed. In October 1941, 3 regiments were established. One of them was the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. The women who volunteered came from all backgrounds. Some were university students. Some were factory workers. Some had been flying in civilian clubs since they were teenagers. They arrived at Engels Air Base in southern Russia in the autumn of 1941 and found conditions that were far from what they had imagined. The training was rushed, the equipment was scarce, and the aircraft they were given, the Polikarpov Po-2, was not a military plane. It was a training biplane. It was built from plywood and canvas. It had an open cockpit, which meant the pilot sat fully exposed to the freezing night air. It could carry only 2 small bombs at a time. Its maximum speed was roughly 150 kilometers per hour, which was slower than most enemy fighters flew during their landing approach. On paper, it was not a weapon of war. It looked more like something a farmer might use to check on his fields from above. But Marina Raskova and the women who followed her were about to turn that fragile little plane into one of the most feared instruments of the entire Eastern Front. The regiment flew its first combat mission in June 1942, near the Caucasus Mountains in southern Russia. From that night forward, they would not stop. Not for winter, not for rain, not for fog. A typical night's work for a single crew began at dusk and ended just before dawn. Each pilot and her navigator would fly a mission, land, reload the bombs, refuel, and take off again. On a quiet night, a crew might fly 8 missions. On an active night, they flew as many as 18. The planes had no parachutes in the early months. There was no room for them and no budget. The women flew without them anyway. The tactics they developed were born entirely from necessity. The Po-2 was too slow to outrun a German fighter. It flew too low for most anti-aircraft guns to track it accurately. So, the regiment used those limitations as advantages. Crews would approach a target in small formations. 2 planes would act as decoys, drawing the searchlights and the flak. The third would cut her engine entirely. She would glide in silence over the target. Nothing but the sound of wind passing through canvas wings. The soldiers below called that sound the sound of a broomstick sweeping through the sky. They thought it sounded like something from a fairy tale, something unnatural. The pilot would release her bombs in that silence, pull up, restart the engine, and disappear before anyone on the ground had time to react. Nadezhda Popova was one of the regiment's most experienced pilots. She had learned to fly before the war and had joined the 588th in its earliest weeks. She later described what those nights felt like. The cold that reached inside your clothing, no matter how many layers you wore. The darkness so complete that you navigated entirely by memory and by the faint glow of fires burning far below. She flew over 852 combat missions before the war ended. On many of those nights, she was hit by flak and returned to base with her plane barely holding together. On several occasions, she landed a plane with holes through the wings so large she could put her arm through them. She once said that she was not afraid of dying. She was afraid of not delivering the bombs. That was the only thing that mattered to her when she was in the air. The German response to the night witches evolved slowly because it took time for them to understand what they were dealing with. In the beginning, some German commanders refused to believe the reports. The idea that women were flying night bombing missions in training planes was not something they had prepared for. When they finally accepted what was happening, they tried everything to stop it. They placed extra searchlight teams in known target areas. They brought in faster pursuit aircraft to intercept the PO-2s. They offered a special commendation, an automatic Iron Cross, to any German pilot who shot down a night witch. That offer says something important. The Iron Cross was Germany's highest military honor. Shooting down an old biplane was not normally the kind of achievement that earned it. But German High Command understood that these women were causing real damage. More than that, they were causing something that bombs alone cannot explain: fear. The German soldiers on the Eastern Front dreaded the sound of that whispering engine in the dark. The most dangerous moment for any night witch was not the bomb run itself. It was getting caught in the searchlights. When a searchlight locked onto a PO-2, other lights immediately swung toward it. The plane would be trapped in a cone of white light, fully visible, moving too slowly to escape. Anti-aircraft crews would open fire from multiple directions. The pilot had only one option. She would throw the plane into a violent dive and hope to drop below the angle of the lights before the shells found her. Some did, some did not. The regiment lost crews in those moments, women who flew every night for months, who learned every trick, who survived countless close calls, and then one night were simply swallowed by the light and the fire that followed it. Polina Gelman was one of the regiment's navigators. She flew 860 combat missions over the course of the war, one of the highest totals in the entire regiment. She came from Berdikiv, a city in Ukraine with a large Jewish population, a population that was being systematically murdered by German forces while she flew. She knew what was happening to her community. She had heard the reports. She chose not to let that knowledge break her. She let it focus her. Every mission she flew was, for her, an act of direct resistance against everything that was trying to erase her people from the earth. She was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union in 1946, one of 23 women from the regiment to receive that honor. The winter of 1942 into 1943 was especially brutal. Temperatures on the Eastern Front dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius in some areas. The PO-2s were not insulated. The cockpits were open. The women wore whatever warm clothing they could find. Wool scarves wrapped around their faces, gloves so thick it was hard to feel the control stick, goggles that fogged and frosted over. They warmed their hands on the engine cowling before takeoff and tried to hold on to that warmth for as long as possible before the cold took it back. Navigators used red-covered flashlights to read their maps, holding them close to their instruments and shielding the light so it could not be seen from below. They sometimes iced over in flight and had to crack the ice from their goggles with their fingers while still in the air, still navigating, still watching for searchlights. There were nights when weather grounded every other aircraft on the Eastern Front. German bombers stayed on the runway. Soviet fighters were called back to base, and the night witches flew anyway. The regiment's standing orders were clear. Unless the weather made it physically impossible to be airborne, the missions would continue. Commanders on the Soviet side knew what the regiment was providing: constant pressure on German supply lines, fuel depots, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. Night after night, the cumulative effect was real. Bridges were damaged, supply dumps burned. German soldiers who needed sleep to function in battle spent their nights scanning the sky and flinching at sounds. That kind of sustained pressure does not always show up in the history books, but it was felt deeply by the men on the other side. By the summer of 1943, the regiment had been redesignated. They were no longer the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. They were now the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, the designation Guards being one of the highest honors the Soviet military could bestow on a unit. They had earned it through 2 years of combat. They had earned it through thousands of missions flown in aircraft that other pilots would have refused to take into a combat zone. They had earned it through losses that would have broken a lesser unit. The women who survived those losses did not talk much about the ones who did not come back. They talked about the next mission. There was always a next mission. The turning point came in the spring and summer of 1944. The Soviet Union was now advancing. The tide had turned at Stalingrad in early 1943, and the Red Army had been pushing west ever since. The Night Witches were flying deeper into enemy-held territory than they ever had before. Their targets were more heavily defended. The Germans had learned enough about Po-2 tactics to develop specific countermeasures. They positioned fast biplane fighters, aircraft slow enough to match the Po-2's speed, along known approach corridors. They coordinated searchlight teams with aerial patrols. They moved anti-aircraft guns in response to patterns they had identified in the regiment's operations. On the night of July 31st, 1944, a crew from the regiment was caught exactly like this. The pilot was Zhenya Rudneva. She was 22 years old and had completed over 645 missions. She was one of the most skilled pilots in the regiment, known for her calm voice on the radio and her ability to find a target in near-zero visibility. That night, her plane was caught in coordinated searchlights while making a second pass to ensure bomb accuracy. Multiple anti-aircraft positions opened fire simultaneously. The plane was hit in the engine and the wing. It began to descend, trailing smoke. There was no altitude left to attempt a recovery. The plane went down inside German-held territory. Neither Rudneva nor her navigator survived. The loss was not unusual by the brutal mathematics of air combat, but it was felt throughout the regiment in a specific way. Rudneva had been the kind of pilot other women in the regiment looked to, not because she was fearless, but because her fear was obviously real and she flew anyway. When someone like that is gone, the fear of the women who remain does not disappear. If anything, it becomes sharper, more specific. They could see very clearly what this war cost. What made that loss into something larger than one crew was what the regiment chose to do the following night. They flew. Every crew that was able to be airborne was airborne. They hit the same region where Rudneva's plane had gone down. They were not performing a rescue. There was nothing to rescue. They were performing something quieter and harder to name. They were answering. The missions that followed over the next weeks were among the most intense the regiment flew during the entire war. The Germans had concentrated more defenses in that sector. The risks were higher than they had been in months. The Night Witches flew into it every night regardless. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment had flown more than 30,000 combat missions. That number is difficult to hold in your mind. 30,000 individual sorties, each one into hostile airspace, each one in an aircraft built for training, each one flown in darkness by women who had been told, explicitly and repeatedly, that this was not work for women. Across those missions, the regiment had dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on German positions. They had destroyed hundreds of bridges, fuel depots, rail lines, and ammunition dumps. 23 of their members received the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The regiment suffered losses, dozens of women killed over 3 years of continuous operations, but it never once ceased flying. From its first mission in June 1942 to its last in May 1945, it never stopped. The world outside the Soviet Union learned very little about the night witches for decades. The Cold War created a wall, not just between nations, but between histories. In the West, the story of the Eastern Front was often told through the lens of German sources, which had their own reasons for silence on this subject. It was only after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 that the full documentary record began to open. Historians, journalists, and researchers started finding the personal accounts, letters, diaries, interviews recorded in the 1970s and 1980s when many survivors were still alive. What they found was a story that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look. Nadezhda Popova lived until 2013. She was interviewed many times in the years before she died, and she was consistent in how she described the war. She did not describe it as heroic in the way the word is often used. She described it as necessary. She described the cold. She described the darkness. She described the sound the engine made when she cut it over a target, a sound she said she heard in her sleep for years afterward. She described her navigator, who sat behind her in the open cockpit, and the way they communicated on long missions by pulling on each other's sleeve because the wind was too loud for voices. She did not describe glory. She described work, extremely dangerous, unrelenting work, done without complaint because there was no alternative that she was willing to accept. The legacy of the 46th Guards is not just military. It is about what human beings are capable of when the circumstances demand it. These were not trained combat pilots when the regiment was formed. They were students, factory workers, and civilian flyers. They were given inadequate equipment, rushed training, and missions that seemed designed to get them killed. And they flew anyway, night after night, 3 years without stopping. In aircraft that many experienced male pilots would have refused to take into combat. They flew, and they hit their targets, and they came back, and they flew again. Their story belongs to everyone who has ever been told they were not suited for the thing they were called to do. It belongs to anyone who has carried out difficult, dangerous, invisible work, work that others did not see or understand or credit. The night witches flew in darkness, literally and figuratively. For decades, the wider world did not know their names, but on the Eastern Front, in the German trenches, in the command posts and the supply depots, those names were not needed. All that was needed was the sound, that quiet, terrible sound of canvas wings cutting through dark air, and the knowledge that whatever came after it could not be stopped. If this story stayed with you, and I believe it will, there are more stories just like it waiting here. Women, soldiers, decisions, and moments that history almost forgot. If you want to hear them, consider subscribing. These stories deserve to be told to someone willing to listen.